Okay, so we should be live on Facebook now. Thank you all for coming and welcome. I'm Stav, I'm the Director of Community Engagement at Yachad. And if you're new to us, we're a British Jewish organization that mobilizes the British Jewish community in support of a resolution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And we do that by working within the British Jewish community in youth movements and synagogues and communal organizations to really show the wide variety of perspectives that exist in our community. And we do that through advocating for our values in Parliament. And throughout our work, we prioritize platforming the voices of our Palestinian and Israeli partners on the ground, which is why I'm delighted to be launching this webinar series with Amy here from Ir Amim. Every 2 months, we'll be focusing on a topical issue happening on the ground in Israel, Palestine, and then we'll go beyond the headlines to receive an in-depth briefing from one of our partners on the ground. And so I'm really happy that Ir Amim is with us here today. Ir Amim, or City of Nations, is an organization that some of you may already be familiar with from last year's Human Rights Awards, where they were awarded this prize on behalf of NIF UK. And they also took part in our campus tour this spring. So we're very happy for this partnership. Ir Amim was founded in 2000 and aims to render Jerusalem a more equitable and sustainable city for both the Palestinians and the Israelis who live in it, and to secure a negotiated solution for the city. I'm really happy that Amy Cohen, who is the Director of International Relations and Advocacy of Ir Amim, is here with us today. And she'll be focusing on the racist and violent flag march that we saw happening in the city last week and really placing it in the context of settlement expansion and the acceleration of settlement expansion in Eastern Jerusalem under this new extremist government in Israel. So Amy's briefing will last for about half an hour, and after that we will have time for a Q&A. So if you have any questions, if you're joining us on Zoom, feel free to pop them in the Q&A box that you can see at the bottom of your screen. If you're joining us on Facebook, feel free to comment on the live stream video, and I will be monitoring the comment section, and we'll aim to finish by 8 p.m. Thank you very much. And yeah, I'll hand over to you, Amy.
Great. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And of course, first and foremost, I want to just thank Yachad for organizing this event and allowing us to take part in it as you launch these series. And then it's a great opportunity for us to be here to strengthen our partnership and cooperation with you all. I think what I want to do is I really want to begin by quoting a member of one of the communities that we work with, whose family is not only facing demolition of their home, but also forced eviction from a separate home in the same neighborhood known as Silwan. And for me personally, it's a very powerful and very striking, because it captured the depth of the oppression and the injustice the Palestinians face in Jerusalem. And what it was, he was describing to a group of individuals about what his family and his community were facing and experiencing. And his name is Kutabe. And he captured it by saying, it is as if our very homes and our very being and existence in this city is under assault from all directions and on all levels, meaning from below the ground, on the ground, and even above the ground. And, for me, I feel like this really captures and encapsulates the essence of what is taking place in East Jerusalem today, and really has been taking place for many years now. And what we see it culminates around what we call the private and collective Palestinian home. We can talk about data, we can talk about numbers, and we can talk about policies and laws and legislation or the legal system, which is something extremely important and critical, because it's what is ultimately causes mechanisms or processes of Palestinian displacement, and then forecloses any sort of prospect for an agreed upon solution to the conflict. But I think what is also just as powerful is to break it down into human terms, into this human dimension, because it's so much more relatable, and it reveals this kind of acute injustice. And when you think about home, what comes to your mind? Home is synonymous with safety, or with security, or with a safe haven. It's also beyond that. It also is its identity and its connection and ties to a particular place. And so what we've seen over the years is that the home is what has been targeted. these individual but also collective rights to their home in the city. And so one of the ways that we have been describing this is that the home, the Palestinian home, has really become the front line in the political battle over the future of Jerusalem. And when you think about it as a Jew, I am an American Jew who moved to Israel nearly 20 years ago. And I think many of us from Jewish communities abroad, but even here, Israeli Jews, we often regard Jerusalem. There's something extremely special and remarkable. There's this essence of home for many of us. It's also not only home, but it's also sacred and it's holy. And there's this inherent historic and religious connection to the city. Yet it can be so easy to overlook the fact that it also serves as home, and it's profoundly holy and symbolic for another people, and also faiths beyond our own. And even with that, political aspirations of those that also live within the city. And what I'm, namely referring to are the Palestinian people. And I think it's really important for us as Jewish people, I'm speaking as an American Israeli Jew, that are working in an organization, an Israeli Jewish organization that is working to advance an agreed upon solution, but even more so in the absence of an agreed upon solution to the conflict, is working to advance equal civil and human rights for all within the city. And it's so important for us to be able to recognize and acknowledge not only the city's binational and multi-religious nature, but also this significantly deep historic, national, religious, political attachments and ties that Palestinians also have to Jerusalem, just like we as Jewish people have as well. And what we've really seen over the years is that there's been this escalation in attempts to erode and to alter this very beautiful binational and multi-religious identity and reality of the city. We've seen attempts to erase the Palestinian presence in Jerusalem, not only in terms of their population, in terms of tangibly demographics, but also in terms of its character and the symbolic nature of the city, where what it does is it ends up translating into undermining Palestinian rights to their homes and to the city. And that really brings me to the topic, or one of the topics today, is the Jerusalem Day Flag Parade, which I'm sure many of you have followed, have seen clips of it. It's since really 2021. It has captured the world's attention because of various different security implications, because of the fact that it triggered a conflagration or escalation with Hamas in 2021. Of course, there were many other triggers which brought about this security, if you want to call it that, escalation with and then of course escalation with of course Hamas, and then of course it also brought about all of this conflict and rioting within mixed cities. And a lot of the triggers behind that were also what was taking place within Jerusalem, these processes of displacement that was emerging from Sheikh Jarrah. If some of you were following it at that time, there were Palestinian families that are still, but at that time they were under imminent threat of eviction from their homes. And then it was also at a time where there were a lot of arbitrary measures, police brutality and violence that took place around Damascus Gate and on the Temple Mount al-Sharif, which ended up causing this escalation. But it was essentially all at the same time. It was brewing around the time of the Jerusalem Day, and hence the Jerusalem Day Flag Parade. And so since 2021, the Jerusalem Day Flag Parade, which was once kind of something that was very much on the fringes, has really captured the world's attention, and rightfully so, because it is such an explicit and stark example of this undermining of rights of Palestinians to their homes and to the city, but also eroding the presence in the city and the multi-religious and multicultural identity and character of the city. And it really is so strikingly exemplified because, the Jerusalem Day Flag Parade is to mark but also reenact the capture of East Jerusalem 1967 and its reunification. Okay, of course, according to organizations like ourselves, we see this as the occupation of East Jerusalem and this unilateral, illegal annexation of East Jerusalem and the people within it, the people that inhabited East Jerusalem. But in addition to this reenactment and marking of this very significant but also very challenging event for Palestinians, is that over the years it has become this grotesque display of Jewish supremacy, of dominance, of triumphalism, and with that you have acts of violence and harassment. You also have the infringement on Palestinian freedom of movement and of access to the city. And for years, Ir Amim has worked to call upon the authorities through legal and public action to prohibit or to somehow ban the route of the route of the parade or the march from going through the Muslim quarter, to reroute it out of respect for Palestinian rights and their space and their dignity. And I'll give you an example, is that even this year, we submitted a legal petition. This is one of the ways in which Ir Amim works. We engage in legal action. We don't necessarily provide, say, legal representation for individual affected Palestinians from various different violations, but what we do is that we essentially file principal petitions or appeals, and go after, say, the bureaucratic mechanisms, or go after the various different organs of the government or authorities that enable for a certain violation to take place. So for instance, this year we filed a petition against not only the parade, but against the expansion of the parade, because what we found was that there were 2 additional routes of the parade that were going to go from 2 settler enclaves around the area of Mount of Olives, and then go through Palestinian neighborhoods to the Western Wall, entering through one of the gates, the Dung Gate. And basically for us, we saw this as an expansion of the parade, and therefore petitioned the Supreme Court against it, because it was built on many years of filing petitions. And unfortunately, what we've seen time and time again, and unfortunately this time, is that we've seen this capitulation to extremist voices, where not only have the Israeli authorities capitulated and continually over the years allowed for the route of the parade to continue to go through Damascus Gate and the Muslim Quarter, but even this year as well, the Supreme Court has upheld the decision of the authorities, accepting their essentially description of what has taken place and what has taken place over the years, accepting kind of their description of it, and so therefore upholding the state's authorities' a decision to allow it to proceed. And while on one hand, it is very, very disappointing that even with the Supreme Court, which has been over the years, some kind of modicum or semblance of preservation of democracy and human rights, of course, that is on a very, very small level, is that what we've seen is time and time again, there has been this kind of acquiescence or this capitulation to these extremist voices, or to even the police, saying that the police can indeed be able to contain the violence or contain the harassment or assaults. And what we've seen, and from this particular year, what we have seen is that that is not the case, that even though there is this immense and massive police presence on the ground that has allowed, essentially it has allowed for the marchers to march without the presence of Palestinians around, is that even in spite of that, there are still acts of violence and incidents of harassment and assault, which this year in particular, there were colleagues of mine that were on the ground, including our deputy director, that was subject to assault and to harassment on the part of the marchers, and yet there was very little intervention and involvement from the police, or even those that are marching with these young, because many of those that engage in these acts of violence, or say acts of harassment and so forth, or vandalism that we've seen, is that they tend to be the male youth. They tend to be young youth that have been bussed in from yeshivas or bussed in from various different schools throughout the country, and they're the ones that often engage with it. But what is even more, that in itself is obviously extremely challenging to see, and it's also very disappointing to see. But at the same time, I think what is even more disappointing is the fact that there's very little intervention from any of, say, the school authorities or any of the older individuals that are present during this parade or march intervening. And so what we've seen again is time and time again that this is something that continually takes place, and that there's really no intervention from anyone around. I think what I would say again, while it is disappointing that we weren't able to, say, reroute or to prohibit the parade from marching through the Muslim quarter this year, is that we have been able to, over the years, in particular this year, is elicit really public discourse and even criticism regarding the parade within Israeli society around it and its moral depravity, spurring alternative events or spurring a protest or demonstrations and even refusals to participate in such a march. And so in that sense, there is some sort of positive gain or some sort of positive outcome of this, because we're able to begin to elicit more of a nuanced discussion regarding Jerusalem Day, the Jerusalem Day parade, but not only that, also the Jerusalem Day events in itself and what it actually means to celebrate such a day, what it means for the Palestinian population within the city, how this is not an event that is including them, but it's one that not only excludes them, but also is an event that marks really their continued oppression and the continued injustice that that they face. And so I think on that sense, it is a positive outcome. Beyond that, though, one of the things that I really want to emphasize, and this will kind of segue into the latter part of our discussion today, is that it is important to remember that the flag parade in all of its depravity is really less than one day. It takes place in less than one day in the life under occupation as stateless residents in East Jerusalem that are daily deprived of full civil and human rights. And so, for us and for Palestinians, the flag parade is more of this explicit manifestation of an overarching Israeli policy and practice on the ground, which in itself is driven and informed by Jewish supremacy. And one of the ways in which this plays out is in the deep systematic discrimination and disparities in housing and urban planning within East Jerusalem, which ultimately serves as a lever of displacement. It ultimately pushes Palestinians from Jerusalem. And it goes back to what I began with, of how so much of the policies, so much of the practices, and so much of what we're seeing culminates around the Palestinian home. And so what do I mean by this is that from 1967 into today, and I'm going to show a map in a few minutes, but from 1967 until today, of course, since the occupation and annexation, illegal and unilateral annexation of East Jerusalem, is that policy making has been guided and informed by two factors and two considerations. One is demographic and one is territorial, meaning is that the goal has been to, one, alter its demographic composition. Because if you think about it, in Israeli policymakers' minds, in Jewish Israeli policymakers' minds, here they have in 1967, in their mind, they have unified the city. And so the city of Jerusalem has now become this kind of unified eternal capital of Israel. And so it must be inherently Jewish. How do we ensure that it is inherently Jewish? Is that we must preserve a Jewish demographic majority in the city, while at the same time solidifying control over more and more territory. And so one of the main policies that has enabled this to take place, meaning to ensure that there is more and more expansion of Israeli control over more land and more territory and over more resources in East Jerusalem, while at the same time increasing the Jewish demographic, while curbing the Palestinian population, is through housing and urban planning policy. And so a way that I can kind of encapsulate it is, while they plan and they build for some, they demolish for others. And so what I want to do here is I want to just share a screen to kind of understand a little bit of what has happened here. I'm going to share hold on one moment. Let's see if we can see here. So what we're seeing, let's just see, is let me just move this over. I hope that you're able to see the map here. This is a map of, obviously, it's called Greater Jerusalem, but we're going to focus on Jerusalem, and I'm going to just zoom in here. This area, let's just put West Jerusalem to the side, because basically what we're speaking of here is East Jerusalem. So this is the area that we are speaking of today. And to just do a really quick crash course on history, okay, in 1967, just within the area of Jerusalem, is that Israel not only occupied but annexed the area of East Jerusalem, but they didn't just annex this area within the yellow dotted line, which was essentially historical Jerusalem throughout much of history. It was also Jordanian Jerusalem. It was 7 square kilometers. But what Israel did in 1967 was that it expanded the municipal border all the way out to the blue line. If you could see it, I'm tracing it now with my mouse. And what it did was it expanded the municipal border from 7 square kilometers to now 70 square kilometers around to the blue line, which is the annexation line or the new municipal border. And what it did within that was that it essentially absorbed about 27 to 28 Palestinian neighborhoods within to now what is considered sovereign Israeli territory. It applied its laws of jurisdiction and administration to the area. And all of the areas that are marked in brown are the Palestinian neighborhoods. Now, why I'm focusing a little bit on a crash course of history here is it's really important to understand what has happened from 1967 until today in terms of settlement building, urban planning policy, and residential development. And settlement construction, while there's such a geopolitical component to settlement construction, whenever you hear about settlement construction, there's often equated to the geopolitical implications of it. The more settlement building there is, the more it forecloses prospects for an agreed upon solution to the conflict, namely a two-state solution. But there is another aspect of it and another component of urban planning and residential development, and that is a human rights component, okay? And so what has happened over the years, and I'm going to explain how we break this down, where is this human rights component? So post-1967, Israel, particularly within the early 1970s and 1980s, is that the Israeli government confiscated about 1/3 throughout, okay? So throughout East Jerusalem here, confiscated about 1/3 of private Palestinian land. The majority of it was private Palestinian land for the establishment of settlements. And those settlements are areas like here in Ramot, areas like French Hill down here, areas down in the southern perimeter, Gilo, Har Homa, East Talpiot, and so forth, that's marked in dark blue. And these are areas that once belonged, much of it was agricultural areas that belonged to the Palestinian villages at the time, but they were confiscated. This land was confiscated to make settlements. And as you can see, they were particularly, the way that they're located is that they fragment Palestinian space, and they also increase territorial control over the green line, okay? So this is the green line. It marks the 1949 armistice line, okay? And of course, we all should know East Jerusalem is over the green line, okay? And therefore considered, of course, occupied territory according to international law. But essentially what happened is when Israel confiscated this land, they used it for these large housing projects over the green line, okay? And is continuing to today. But in terms of, in addition to, of course, this geopolitical component of, okay, the more that we build, the more that we can, of course, undermine conditions for an agreed upon solution, is that it also, number one, fragments the Palestinian space, because you can see how when you divide, you fragment, you fracture the Palestinian space, you are not only foreclosing prospects of some sort of Palestinian territorial contiguity, but you are also you are hedging in Palestinian neighborhoods. And so what you have here is that this inability for a lot of, even over here, okay, or over here or down here, this inability for Palestinian neighborhoods to be able to expand, for them to be able to, for residential development or urban planning. And so it hedges in the Palestinian neighborhoods. And then number three is that what we've seen is not only have the Israeli authorities confiscated one-third of Palestinian land, but they have also continually building more and more settlements, even till today, under this current government, which continues to deplete and exhaust further land reserves and vacant land within East Jerusalem, which then serves as an impediment to Palestinian urban planning and residential development. Now, that is not all, because in addition to these kind of impediments to the expansion of Palestinian neighborhoods or their own residential development of this expansion, but it also places severe restriction within Palestinian neighborhoods themselves, which then serves as this lever of displacement. Because if you think about it, if you are not able to build a home, build a roof over the top of your head, or you're not able to obtain a building permit, or the Israeli authorities do not advance zoning plans or outline plans for Palestinian areas, there is, of course, then no way to then be able to build or construct a home. So what does it automatically do? It automatically pushes Palestinians outside of the city. And of course, this then allows Israel to begin to cannot begin, but continue to decrease this Palestinian demographic. It kind of serves again as this lever to decrease the Palestinian population within the city, because it ends up causing them causing them to be pushed out of the city. I'm going to stop sharing now so that I can continue speaking directly to you now. Let's see, hopefully that has all worked. And so as kind of an example of this, just to kind of show you this stark disparity and how this plays out, I talked about this 1/3 of confiscation of Palestinian land, but then another 1/3 was also declared as green space, and that precludes urban planning and residential development. So then the only area that is actually designated for Palestinian residential development is really the 1/3 that was the existing Palestinian areas at the time of 1967. And so just to give you an example of this stark discrimination is that while Israel has built, and you saw it on the map, Israel has built approximately around 10 to 12 settlements, depending upon how you count and how they're divided up, 10 to 12 new settlements / neighborhoods, over the Green Line since 1967, and continuing to advance more plans. As we speak, not one new neighborhood has been approved or constructed for Palestinians since 1967, despite them constituting nearly 40% of the population today. And as I mentioned previously, is that this focus on settlements of being of this geopolitical component, but again, there's this human rights element. There's this twofold ramifications on the ground. As well, it's consolidating Israel's holding control of more land and more control of East Jerusalem. It also deprives Palestinian of housing opportunities and building and planning rights. And so as I mentioned prior to this, is that, well, many settlement plans are intended for land adjacent or even in Palestinian neighborhoods. So there are settlement plans like, I'll even give you an example of Kidmat Zion or Nof Zion, these settlement plans that maybe you've heard in the news and so forth. These are settlements that are planned for within Palestinian neighborhoods, and yet they're not designated for the community's development needs, but rather for new Israeli housing projects over the Green Line. And so, as I mentioned before, when I spoke about the map, number one, it depletes and exhausts all land reserves, which could be used for Palestinian development. It blocks then the growth and expansion of them, but then it also fragments Palestinian space. And so, in addition, though, to that, it's like last but not least, is that, well, tens of thousands of housing units are advanced annually, and I'll give you just a few stats to kind of compare. While they're advanced annually for Israeli settlements in East Jerusalem, residential development in even existing Palestinian areas are virtually neglected. And so what happens is this lack of equitable urban planning and housing solutions. They either force Palestinians out of Jerusalem, as I mentioned before, or they compel them to construct homes without building permits, which then subjects them to the threat of demolitions. And I'm sure, if you have not read about it, many of you have probably heard about it, that there is this massive massive threat of demolition, and there's been a rise of demolitions over the past few years, since particularly 2019, when they have increased, the Israeli authorities basically amended the building and planning law to increase punitive measures against building infractions. And of course, these are not just building infractions because Palestinians choose to build without building permits. It's actually because of a reality that has been created by the Israeli authorities' neglect, and intentional really neglect, of advancing zoning plans or outline plans for Palestinian areas. And so with that, it then again either pushes Palestinians out or compels them to build without building permits, and then subjects them to the threat of demolition. So for instance, just since the start of 2023, we have recorded 104 demolitions, and 58 of them have been homes. And it's an astronomical amount of demolitions if you think about it. Again, going back to the original quote from Kutabe, who spoke about the home as being under attack and under threat. And this is really the essence of it. So rather than the home serving as a place of security and safety, it actually ends up becoming this home of, the demolition of the home ends up becoming this kind of form of continued injustice and oppression and plight for Palestinians. I just want to give you one example before I conclude, this portion, just as a comparison in terms of the contrast between what we see in Israeli settlements and neighborhoods versus what we see in Palestinians, is that since the start of 2023 and the formation of this current extreme right-wing government, is that there has been this major acceleration of settlement plans. We've seen an acceleration of settlement plans since 2021, but particularly under this government, and even within the past few weeks, there's just been this kind of barreling forward of settlement plans, particularly within very, very strategic areas. And so to give you an example of this, is that since the start of 2023, there have been 22 outline plans or zoning plans for Israeli settlements that have been advanced, 5 of which are for the establishment of new settlements, with the total of over 16,000 housing units have been advanced in East Jerusalem, compared to a very minimal nominal amount for Palestinians. And so it shows the disparity in housing and in building and planning, which again, as I mentioned before, it has such a stark human rights component, and is really important to really focus on not only the geopolitical but also on the human rights aspect of it. And so, in conclusion, what I would say is that what we've seen is that such developments really, they only continue to cement this one state reality of permanent occupation, whereby one group is afforded full civil and human rights, while the other is deprived of the rights. And so we see this as, in the absence of a foreseeable political horizon and an end to this reality, is that the focus really must be holding Israel accountable to international law, is to ending the impunity and preferential treatment that is accorded to Israel in the international arena, and demanding that the government afford East Jerusalem residents with the most basic rights: the right to property, the right to housing and shelter, and the right to family and community life. And this would play out in the form of holding Israel accountable to halt settlement plans, number one, but then number two, to truly advance and approve residential plans for Palestinians. And I want to leave this with you, because I want to kind of leave you with a positive achievement, a positive game, kind of a glimmer of hope. Is that it has to do with a Palestinian community that we are working with to advance a residential plan along the southern perimeter of East Jerusalem. The area is known as Walajeh. Some of you have heard of it and may have been following it. We have been doing a lot of work with it and a lot of publication around it because of the threat of mass demolition within this area. But serves as a glimmer of hope, because there has been a small but significant achievement, and it still needs our work, but it can be used as a model and a flagship. And what it is that moving from halting demolitions to securing housing and planning rights. And this success we've seen so far has been with this community. It's an agricultural community by the name of Walaje on the southern perimeter of East Jerusalem. It's bisected by the municipal border, and so the northern section of the village is in the Jerusalem municipality, even though they do not receive any services. The only form of services, as the residents often say, the only form of services that they receive are demolitions. And basically the entire part of this area that's in the Jerusalem municipality has faced mass demolition. And over the past few years, there has been essentially a class action suit that has protected 38 homes from demolition. And what we've seen is that over the years, while the state has been against an urban planning solution and against residential development, what we've been able to do, because of persistent concerted domestic lobbying and international support, is that we have been able to cause a shift in the state's stance towards urban planning in Walaje. We are working to advance a residential plan that will not only legalize the existing homes, which will expand beyond the 38 homes that are in this class action suit, but that will actually legalize the existing homes within Walaje, at the same time providing a solution for future residential development within the village. And so right now, as we speak, the village, along with our organization and our partner organization, BIMCOM, village residents, and then of course an urban planner, we are working together to advance actual residential plan. And so far, meaning last year in March at a Supreme Court hearing, and then again subsequently in December 2022, there was a shift in the state's stance towards urban planning, and they agreed to another demolition freeze, to extend the demolition freeze on these 38 homes, and express support, tacit support for urban planning in this area. What we are working on now is that in June, so just a month from now, the residents of the village and the organizations together must present an update to the Supreme Court on the advancement of the plan. And our belief and hope, we're crossing fingers, is that again, it is not secure, but this is our hope, is that the state will again, with of course the agreement of the Supreme Court, will agree to an extension of the demolition freeze to allow for the residential development and the plan to continue. And so this is just to leave you with kind of a glimmer of hope that despite the very depressing and disheartening situation on the ground, and despite the fact that we do need to continue to work for full, equal civil and human rights for Palestinians, that this is something that we can hold on to, and that we hope to even replicate, that can be used as a flagship, that we not only halt the human rights violations, but we end up moving towards securing human rights for all within Jerusalem. And so I thank you for your time, and I guess I can turn it back over to Stav for question and answer and so forth.
Thank you very much, Amy. That was wonderful. I mean, very enlightening, I think, and it's great that you managed to include the whole historical trajectory as well in such a short period of time. So thank you very much. And I think, as you say, the situation is depressing, but it's wonderful that we have, people like you on the ground who are making a difference. The Q&A is open. We have one question at the moment, and I'll start us off with that. But for those of us who are with us on the Zoom call, please do click the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. So that's separate from the chat button, and add your questions. And if you're watching us live on Facebook, then feel free to add a question in the comment section. But yes, so Matthew Gothill asks, what mechanisms prevent or deter Palestinians from moving into areas designated as quote unquote Jewish in Eastern Jerusalem?
Yeah, sure. So there are various different mechanisms that that prevent Palestinians from moving into these areas. I mean, what, you know, I will say, like a bit of a caveat, is that we have seen in some particular areas, we have seen that there has been a bit of a move of Palestinians to some of these areas that are, say, Israeli Jewish settlements. But for the most part, it's very difficult because of the fact that there's often discrimination in terms of purchasing the homes within these areas and then also renting the homes. So for instance, particularly, let's say a home is owned by a Jewish family within a particular neighborhood, and then if a Palestinian family were to seek to rent out the home in this Israeli settlement or a Jewish neighborhood, then therefore they are often met with discrimination. Okay, so while it may not be like de jure or de jure discrimination that's implicit within the law, it often plays out in de facto discrimination or whatever prejudice, and so therefore it obviously deters Palestinian families from moving in. The other is that it's also because of the fact that there is so much segregation in itself within East Jerusalem or within Jerusalem itself. It's not inviting. It's not inviting for Palestinians to move into, say, an old Jewish neighborhood, because of the fact that they are then going to not be without family, without community. They also are not going to have, say, religious institutions. They're not going to have religious houses of worship in these areas, because what we've seen, and this is just to give you an example, is that, and this is how we know, we often get the question of, okay, how do you know that this particular plan for this area in East Jerusalem is actually designated for an Israeli Jewish settlement project? And one of the ways that we easily can pinpoint it is because if you look at the details of the plan, the only religious institutions or the only say houses of worship that they have allocated land for are for synagogues or for mikvehs. And so we automatically know that it is designated for a particular portion of the population. And so this is just kind of another example of okay, if there is not a mosque, or is there's not other religious institutions, or even communal institutions that were in the area, it's going to obviously deter Palestinian families from moving into these areas. It's also not going to be welcoming. Again, that's not to say that it doesn't happen on a very limited scale. And what we have seen is, because of the fact that there is so much suppression of residential development and limitations on existing Palestinian neighborhoods, we have seen a move of Palestinian families beginning to move into some of these Israeli settlements and neighborhoods because of the lack of planning solutions or lack of housing solutions.
So I think, I mean, in the absence of other questions, and again, everyone feel free to ask questions. I have a few questions. And so I'm wondering, you talked a lot about kind of the public and the physical geopolitical sphere and the exclusion of Palestinians from that, both in terms of, very concrete events like the flag march last week, but also in terms of planning. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the political exclusion of Palestinians from the city, in terms of involvement in making these plans to begin with, in making policy, in what is often seen as a democracy.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things, I didn't really have time to go into, and this was really one of the policies that were determined from 1967 onward, is that in addition to the discrimination in urban planning and, say, suppression of residential development, is that Palestinians, when Israel unilaterally annexed East Jerusalem, is that Palestinians were not granted automatic citizenship. Okay, they were not afforded citizenship, and with that also is the deprivation of political rights. Okay, so what they were afforded with were residential rights, and it is known as permanent residency. Permanent residency is very misleading, because permanent residency can always be revoked. And this was one of the means, again, as I mentioned, there were various different policies and various different measures to, say, curb the Palestinian demographic. And one of this was the denial, number one, of political rights, but the denial of, say, collective citizenship and not granting citizenship immediately. There is often an argument of, well, they can always apply for citizenship. The issue is with that argument is that the decision on whether or not they become citizens still is in the hands of the Israeli authorities. A very, very small percentage of Palestinians that have actually applied for citizenship, I'm trying to remember, I believe it's around 5%, have actually received citizenship. And this is despite thousands of applications for citizenship. And so when the argument is presented that, well, they can always apply for citizenship, it's quite misleading, because the decision to grant citizenship is still within the hands of the Israeli authorities. And so they either don't approve the citizenship request, or they basically drag their feet, and it's in this perpetual state of pending status. Okay, so in the absence of citizenship, is that, number one, your residency, of course, can be revoked, and then number two is that you are denied political rights. While you were given some form, of course, social rights, say access to healthcare, is that they're also very limited and curbed. What I want to go back to, though, is this absence of political rights, is because in the absence of political rights, and when I mean political rights is the absence of being able to participate in national elections, being able to participate in the political and legislative processes which determine their lives, because of the fact that Jerusalem is the internal united capital of Israel, is that most of the decisions, most of the most significant decisions that are made for the city are made at a federal and a national level, which therefore prevents and precludes Palestinians from being able to participate within these processes in any way. In shape and form. And so that of course goes hand in hand of the inability to then participate in, say, this kind of overarching urban planning process. I will say, though, is what often happens in kind of the absence of the Israeli authorities promoting zoning plans or outline plans for Palestinian areas, is that Palestinians then take the responsibility upon themselves as a private initiative, but then they then have to pay this exorbitant amount of money and fees in order to be able to do that. And it comes with a lot of work and a lot of burden. And oftentimes what happens, because there is not an Israeli authority that is behind the plan, and again, these are very small plans, they're called spot plans, that is, say, for a house or for a small plot. It's not for an entire neighborhood like the Israelis are doing for Jewish Israelis. But what often happens is, what we've seen over the years, is that the plans are continually blocked, is that they get to a certain point and they're not approved. Or if they are approved, it's only approved for, something very, very small in terms of the residential rights that are given, and what is allocated is for, say, commercial use or so forth. And so you see that even when Palestinians are able to, they have the funds and they have the time or the resources to be able to advance a plan for their private property, is that oftentimes it's not implementable or it's not approved. And so therefore, it's like another level of discrimination. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think, no, that's very comprehensive. And I think it's really good, even, in the very basic sense, the fact that I think Palestinian residents in East Jerusalem don't have Israeli citizenship is something that is not very commonly talked about. We have another question now from the chat. From Raphael Korber-Hoffman, who asks, does Jerusalem's high profile and significance to many international religious and political groups have an influence in domestic political decision making?
Yes, I mean, definitely. It definitely does. And I could go several ways with this. I think one of what we've seen, and of course this is something that is very prominent within Jerusalem, in terms of the settler enterprise and a lot of the ideological settler organizations and their cooperation, their work hand in glove with the Israeli authorities, is that it very much influences domestic policy, and it very much influences what takes place on the ground. So both the policy and also practices. But I would say, beyond that, is that you also have a lot of also competing interests. So you have, of course, churches who have the Greek, for instance, the Greek church, they own a massive amount of property. And you may have seen this in the news, but unfortunately, the Greek church has come under a lot of criticism because of the fact that over the years, under the previous Greek patriarch, was that it was revealed that they ended up selling some very, very iconic Christian properties in the old city to settler organizations. And so this is just kind of another example of how it affects policy and how it affects practices on the ground. And what ultimately takes place is that you have, and this goes back to what I mentioned before, is kind of this erosion of this multicultural, multi-religious, and binational character and identity of the city. And it plays out in the form of these various different competing interests. But ultimately, what is continually advanced and what we're seeing is that this very ideological settler organizations working very closely with the government. And unfortunately, now what we have is a very extreme right-wing government who these types of forces are within the government themselves and are able to push forward these policies and are able to push forward this type of legislation that will transform and alter the space even more.
Thank you very much, Amy. We have two more questions now, and I am aware that we're also running out of time, so maybe if we can keep it short. But Rabbi Eli Tikvasara asks on Zoom, how does the expansion of Israeli settlements into Palestinian neighborhoods impact Palestinian employment?
That's a good question. I don't know if it necessarily, infects Palestinian employment directly. I think one thing that I could mention here that will have just an acute and very dire impact on Palestinian businesses. And this is actually an example that's taking place right now in an area called Wadi Joz, which is, it's basically right below Mount Scopus area. It's kind of connected to Mount Scopus, if you're all familiar with it. I'm sorry that I can't bring up the map because we're limited time, but it's an area, Wadi Joz is known for an area that is a very bustling industrial Palestinian area with a lot of various different small businesses and small shops that have been there for years. It's one of the main areas for Palestinian commerce in the city, and the Jerusalem municipality, along with other Israeli authorities, are right now in the process of trying to completely transform the space into what they are calling Silicon Wadi, which will entail a complete demolition of around 200 Palestinian businesses, small businesses that have been flourishing for years, in order for Jerusalem municipality and the Israeli authorities to build what they call is this high-tech hub, now known as Silicon Wadi. And the fear is not only are the implications of this dire implications on present Palestinian businesses and also homes in the area, but the acute concern is that while the Israeli authorities have posited and characterized it as something that will benefit Palestinian Jerusalem, there is acute concern that will actually be used to move in Israeli high-tech companies and Israeli and international employees in the area and completely transform the space, meaning completely erasing the Palestinian presence from the area and transform it into kind of this international Israeli space. And so, I mean, this is a prime example and actually directly answers your question. And so this is one of the things that we are working on, Ir Amim working on along with our partner organizations to try and halt, because we see that it will have really disastrous ramifications on Palestinian Jerusalem.
Thank you very much, Amy. Yeah, that's a very worrying development. I haven't actually heard about it myself. Our final question is from Facebook, and I think it would also be a really good question to end on. And Jessica says, thank you for speaking, and this was really interesting, and asks, what can we be doing from the UK to support this situation?
Yeah, very good question. Yeah, I mean, I think there are, a few different channels that, one can pursue. I mean, I think first and foremost, being able to partner together with organizations like yourselves. And I think what is important to first and foremost is to amplify and to give platform to Palestinian voices and to what is taking place on the ground in Jerusalem, not only from the perspective of the geopolitical, as I mentioned there, so much for so many years has been focused on kind of the geopolitical sphere and on, okay, let's preserve conditions for, an agreed upon solution. But I think right now what the focus needs to be is amplifying voices of Palestinians and calling upon the UK, calling upon your policymakers and your decision makers and the international community to really hold Israel accountable to international law and to hold Israel accountable also to even the UK's standards. I mean, many of these countries, as an American, I can speak, the US often talks about these shared values, or the UK speaks about shared values with Israel, and to really say, okay, what are these shared values? If you are not able to afford equal civil and human rights to both populations within Jerusalem, then how does this represent shared values? How does this represent any sort of shared aspiration between these two countries? And I think really pressing upon that, how is this compliant to international law? I think that is really what's most important. And again, with that is amplifying the Palestinian voices and giving them platform to the injustices and to the oppression, and really calling and demanding your decision makers and your policy makers to act on their behalf and to shift policy in a way that will hold Israel accountable.
Thank you very much, Amy, and thank you so much again for coming and joining us today. I really appreciate it. I think this was a brilliant start to this webinar series. It was great to hear, both about the situation on the ground, but also about the wonderful work that you do at Ir Amim. I think we really appreciate you as partners. I mean, what I didn't mention at the beginning is that, the way that I encountered Ir Amim was through your tours on the ground. And when we bring delegations of the British Jewish community, we often take part in your tours of East Jerusalem. And I think that if, the people on the call right now want to really experience and see everything that Amy has been discussing on the ground, that's a really brilliant way to do that. And, I had a talk with some of Amy's colleagues earlier today about their educational work. And I do think that through all of this work that you're doing, whether, in the courtrooms or on the streets or in the classrooms, you're really changing the conversation around Jerusalem in Israel, Palestine, and internationally. So thank you so much again for joining us. Before we finish, I'd just like to invite everyone who's watching to 2 more events that we have coming up. So our next briefing will take place in July, on the 19th of July, Wednesday. We'll be joined by Physicians for Human Rights in Israel, who will be briefing us on their new report on the impact of the Israeli blockade on Gaza, on the psychological distress and mental health conditions amongst Palestinian women. So I think, Gaza has recently been in the headlines, but it's very important to keep the focus on it even when it's no longer in the headlines. So hopefully we'll be doing that in a couple of months' time, and it will be wonderful if you join us. The second event that we have coming up is on the 27th of June. we're going to have our annual fundraiser, which is the first time that we're holding one in person since COVID. And we're flying over Israel's leading human rights lawyer, Michael Sfard, who will be in conversation with the Liberal Democrat spokesperson for Foreign Affairs and International Development, Leila Moran, who is also the first and only member of parliament of Palestinian descent. And they will be in a conversation facilitated by the acclaimed journalist, Jonathan Friedland. So if you would like to join us for that, I will send around links for that as well. And I think that will be a brilliant way to also continue the conversation that Amy raised in terms of international accountability. Because, Amy, you were discussing the kinds of principal petitions that you raise in the courts in Israel and how sometimes those aren't quite implemented to the degree that we would want them to be implemented due to political considerations. And so I think that's really where, we see discussions about the ongoing ICC investigation and the incoming ICJ advisory opinion coming in. And that's what we will be focusing on in June, alongside, the changing British public policy, foreign policy towards Israel, Palestine, with a kind of perspective that Leila Moran brings. Yeah, thank you so much again, Amy, and thank you everyone for joining us with your questions. I hope everyone has a calm and peaceful evening.
Yes,
thank you.
Me too. Thank you, Stav, for this
you.
opportunity. It's wonderful. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good evening. Bye.
Good evening.